Hello everyone, it's Grim Scribe. Hope you're doing well. I wanted to talk today about The Troubles of Dr. Thoths by Thomas Ligotti. Now, if you haven't heard this story, go check out my previous video. It's got my reading of it. And let's just get right into it. I avoided this story for a long time, for many years. I don't really know why, but I would just open a collection of Ligotti stories, and if this happened to be in it, I would look at the first page and I would see the name Alb Indis. And I would just be like, I'm good. Like, I can't do that right now. I don't really know why. It just wasn't my thing. And so I would avoid it for years. And I don't know why, because coming back to read it recently, I found it to be pretty telling about the author's personal beliefs. It's quite an abstract story. The surface level plot doesn't really make much sense, but once you start thinking about what's going on underneath, that's really what the story is about. It's kind of a meta-narrative and kind of an abstract way of conveying some of the author's feelings. I think it really compares to something like The Strange Design of Master Rinaldo, for example. So let's get right into it. I'll do a bare bones summary of the plot, because the plot itself on the surface isn't really the important thing. Like every great story, right, the plot is a way of showcasing some of the deeper themes underneath. So we have an artist. His name is Alb Indis. He lives alone as a recluse. He's an insomniac. He cannot sleep at night, and he uses those hours of night and silence to work on his art. What is his art? He does two types of art. One, he does hyper-realistic sketches of his inner quarters. He lives in this room overlooking a seaside town in a sort of a street. He lives downtown, and he's always sketching his room to the just perfect, minute detail, right? Every little nick and knack that you can possibly think of, he's sketched. However, when it comes to his window, right, the window outside, he doesn't ever show what's out there. He makes it this sort of white void, and we'll get into that. The other type of art that he makes is what he calls collaboration, but you could also call it plagiarization. He takes other artists' images and copies them studiously into this hodgepodge work of art. And the example he gives is like, for example, a subarctic landscape. So you can think a snowy landscape, church that he's never been to or heard of, and some monsters, right? And he puts them all together. He has these monsters attacking the church, and that's one of his drawings. So he puts these in his portfolio. We don't really know why. He doesn't seem to ever show them to anybody. They're just his. He has great technical ability, but he is terrified of his own imagination. He's terrified of things he can't control. And so he exists in this strange sort of half-life in which he is sort of like, his soul is like recirculated air. He is neither here nor there, but just in a sort of limbo state where he's creating this art and existing in the night hours when everyone else is asleep, terrified of his dreams, terrified of his imagination. One day, after a night of no sleep, in the morning hours, he hears, well, actually it's the afternoon hours, he hears a voice outside his room in the street. And it is a sort of dry, crackling, radio-like voice, like shortwave radio, they said. And it's talking about Dr. Thoths, and how it could be the cure of someone's troubles. It's going to be the end of someone's troubles. And he likes that. He says, I've got a lot of troubles on my end. I'd like to get rid of them. He's tried many doctors in the past, and he wonders if this Dr. Thoths could maybe be the person who could give him some sort of remedy. He doesn't really know what sort of remedy, just something in general to make himself feel better about existence, about life itself. So he goes to try to find Dr. Thoths, and he is energized enough by the idea of it to actually leave his apartment. And he goes to this eatery down the street where he reads a newspaper that has a story about Dr. Thoths, learns more about him. He's sort of this occult professor from many generations ago who started psychically deranging some of his patients, some of his closest people that he associated with, and for that was destroyed or decapitated, the story says. It said that he had some strange companion with him, and that companion might have even been the doctor himself. It was about the size of a man's head. It had strange appendages growing out of it, called miracle claws. A strange creature. Most likely the doctor himself. It's kind of what it's alluded to. That's all that Alb Indus is able to get to, because after that, he hears the doctor's voice again. He hears this dry voice, and actually this dry, crackling voice is saying, "I am a doctor. My name is Thoths." Once he hears that, he's snapped out of his reverie. He looks around, he doesn't see him anywhere. But he knows that he was just about to give up, but he knows that, well, he just heard the doctor's voice. This guy's real. Something could possibly be the end of his troubles here. He could have the remedy he's looking for. He doesn't know what that remedy is, but he wants it. So he goes down the street to the only other place he could stomach even being inside of, which is this abandoned church down the road. He goes inside the church, he sits, he meditates, and he starts to hear these voices coalescing all together into one. And he sees the shape of Dr. Thoths in one of the windows. He hears him say, "I am a doctor. My name is Thoths." And he hightails it out of there. He runs away. Goes back to his apartment where he had left the window ajar. And when he gets back in, he finds that one of his drawings has been tampered with. Things have been put on his drawing that he wasn't ready to put on. And if he had looked closer, he would have seen the shape in the chair that he had studiously drawn. And of course, the doctor, this creature, appears, with these twisting appendages, these miracle claws, appears and eats him, devours him completely, leaves only the barest scraps of him left on the bed. They can't even identify him practically. And Alb Indus himself, after this happens, is sort of absorbed into local legendary, just like Dr. Thoths. And that's how the story ends. Now, what does that all mean? We'll get into it, but first let's talk about the main character, Alb Indus. It's a very weird name. I got used to saying it because I said it about 1,000 times during the read I did. It was very challenging for some reason. It was a short story, but God, it was challenging. Let's talk about Alb Indus. Alb, A-L-B. Think of albino, white, without color, drained of color. If you think about the character, it applies to him well. Even his hair is white. He has this blonde, almost white hair. It's really described that way. And they don't often describe characters in Legati, if you notice. They don't really describe what they look like if they do, it's for a very specific reason, right? Authors do these things for a purpose. And so we think of Alb Indus, he's drained of imagination by choice, right? He's like a vampire that's drained himself of blood. His blood is his imagination. And he refuses to engage with the outside world. He refuses to even include the outside world in his drawings of his immediate surroundings. And he had one time this shot of imagination start to come to him, but then it fizzled out. So he's gotten so used to not ever engaging his imagination that he's unable to even access it anymore. He's crammed it all the way down deep within his subconscious. So Alb, right, we think of the color white. We also think of there's a liturgical vestment that people wear in the church. But I mean, the name ultimately means white because it comes from the Latin term albus, which means white. So when we think of Alb Indus, we also have the last name Indus. What does that even mean? Indis, right? Dis is chaos or trouble. So we have this placid surface, right? This lifeless surface, but within troubles are swirling, right? Troubles are swirling. What is his trouble? Well, if you think about his types of art, it kind of explains it. First, he does not ever want to portray the real world, right? Outside of his room. He only wants to portray what he can directly control, what he can directly manifest himself in. He never portrays what's outside the window. And in his second art, this is where it really comes in, he has this picture of a subarctic landscape. That's how he describes it, with a church and then these monsters coming to attack the church. Now, why does he talk about that? I think the reason is because it illustrates who he is. He himself is this subarctic landscape. His soul is the church, right? His inner self is the church. And life, right? Uncertainty is coming towards it, attacking it, assailing it. And he wants to keep all of his imagination, all of his creativity crammed inside this church. He cannot unlock it, because if he unlocks it, that means he has to engage with the world. That means he has to put himself out there. He has to be vulnerable. He has to wager something. Living is wagering and putting yourself out there to be judged. And he is terrified of that. And that is a problem that every artist ever has. You can make all the art you want, but at some point you have to decide if you're going to put it out there or not. And you think about how many artists there are in the world who maybe are fantastic in every way that you've never heard of, right? And they never share their art with anybody. Now, most artists do put their art out in some respect. Al Bindis does not do any of that, and he is sort of steadfastly refused to share himself with the world because he fears its judgment. He fears either being shut down by it and laughed at, or the inverse, right? Fame and fortune, being eaten up by that. We know how many stars have we heard of, right, who've gotten this fame and fortune and not known what to do with it. I think that's Ligotti talking about art. I think that's Ligotti talking about success and about this painful choice of keeping everything to yourself or showing it to the world and having the world judge you. It's certainly something that causes a lot of vulnerability. You know, think about when somebody reads your writing, right? If you wrote something down, you handed it to somebody on a piece of paper, and they read it, and you're sitting there, and they're silently reading it, and you're sweating bullets inside or outside, wondering what they're going to think of it. That's what it is to be an artist when you show yourself to others. That's how Ligotti feels. Now, the other thing that we've got going on in the story is Thoths. Thoths is described as an eater of other people's troubles. Now, what is Alb Indus's trouble? His trouble is life. His trouble is living. He hates living because the act of living is uncertain. The act of living is something that he cannot control all the way. And if he can't control it all the way, then he rejects it. He rejects life, and yet he clings to life. That's the paradox of living. None of us were ever asked to be put onto this planet, and yet here we are, and we have to struggle with that day in and day out. That's how Alb Indus lives. But he has rejected life, and yet he clings to it. And so he wishes for an end to his troubles. But subconsciously, he hasn't, I don't know if he realizes this, because he probably doesn't want to be eaten, that his trouble is life. And so when Dr. Thoths comes and eats him, he's eating his troubles. His trouble is life. So he eats Alb Indus, ending his life, ending his troubles. That is sort of what the story on a deeper level is about, in my opinion. And it's also, I think, plays into some of the pessimistic themes that Ligotti gets into, right? If you've read The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, I have a reading of it. You should check it out if you haven't. And, Ligotti talks about this paradox of life, right? The idea that none of us asked to be here, and yet we are here, and that you can be one of two things, right? You can be like heroic, you can be a pessimist, or you can be a heroic pessimist, right? A pessimistic person is just done with life. A heroic pessimist, right, realizes that life is this great burden and yet persists, right, towards it regardless. Now, it's interesting because Ligotti, and I'm getting into something kind of touchy here, but, You know, Ligotti is somebody, my brother would talk to me about this because he's the one that got me into Ligotti. He talked to me about the idea, he hates the conspiracy against the human race because he was talking about the idea that Ligotti talks about how pointless life is and how it's better not to live and it's better not to be conscious. And yet here he is living and conscious. It's kind of a paradox, isn't it? Much like the main character, Albindus. Now let's talk about Dr. Thoths. Wanted to talk about Dr. Thoths a little bit. His name is interesting, Thoss. Kind of bears some resemblance to Thoth, who is the scribe of the underworld in Egyptian mythology. When you get to the underworld and you're about to go into the actual afterlife, you get to the afterlife, you're about to go to the underworld, Thoth writes your name down and sort of inscribes the names of the dead. It also bears into the idea of, bears relation to Thanatos, the Greek god of the dead. So you have these two names that are revolved around death, right? He's this character that's obsessed with death. And what's fascinating about Dr. Thoths is he's in another story by Thomas Ligotti. One of my favorites, The Last Feast of Harlequin. It's his ode to H.P. Lovecraft, right? One of his very first stories that he ever wrote was The Last Feast of Harlequin. And because it makes sense. I'm just kidding. It is a very sort of straight-laced story, a traditional kind of spooky story. And you have this Dr. Thoths, right? He's this university professor. He goes to the town of Miracaw. Interesting, Miracaw, Miracle Clause. He goes to the town of Miracaw, and he is going there to research this cult, and he ends up becoming the leader of the cult and having great sort of transformative powers, and becomes this being of vast and unimaginable power that is more than human, right? Exists beyond life. I think in this story, he has made his way to the seaside town and been found out somehow and destroyed, leaving only his head behind, which grows these appendages called Miracle Claws. It's a very weird name, Miracle Claws, and I mean, I'm sure other people got to here long before me, but I didn't realize it had any connection to Miracaw until I really put my head on it and thought about it. So there's sort of your relationship between Miracle Claws and Miracaw into The Last Feast of Harlequin and The Troubles of Dr. Thoths. So just a nice little callback to that story. Dr. Thoths is an eater of other people's troubles. The trouble is life. He eats life. Now, it begs the question, is Dr. Thoths good or bad? Because, like, what if my trouble was a fear of death? What if I was terrified of dying? And if Dr. Thoths could make me live forever? Who knows? Begs to be thought about. Now, those were my thoughts on the story today. I'm glad you guys took the time to listen to it. I really appreciate it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. It's very abstract, and I think it bears a good amount of discussion. I've never seen it on YouTube before. No one had read it out loud, which I thought was really interesting. That's one of the reasons why I read it. I couldn't resist reading it. I said, well, nobody's put it on here. Let's put it out there, see what people think. I also wanted to test my brand new microphone that I got. I'll shut up about the microphone. I know I've made posts about it. However, Teatro Grotesco is coming. I'm ready to do it. So I'm very excited to read that to you. Please comment here. Tell me what you think. Tell me your thoughts on the story. And let's keep the discussion going. Hope to see you all in the next one, and have a wonderful day.